Welcome to NTD Evening News. Our top story tonight, President Trump holding a joint press conference with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Find out what the two leaders are saying about a ceasefire deal in Gaza and plans to rebuild the war-torn region. Trump says the U.S. will do very well against China's retaliatory tariffs. More on why fentanyl made in China and China's struggling economy could impact the global market. Senate committees advance RFK Jr. and Tulsi Gabbard to the next step in getting confirmed. NTD's Luis Martinez has the latest. Crews recover the remains of all 67 victims in the mid-airplane collision in Washington, D.C. What investigators are focusing on next.
This is NTD Evening News, live from our global headquarters in New York City. Here's Tiffany Meyer.
Good evening, and thank you for joining us tonight. FBI agents filed 2 lawsuits today, pushing back against Justice Department efforts to identify employees who investigated President Trump. The DOJ is developing a list of employees involved in those inquiries, as well as probes into the January 6th Capitol breach. It demanded the names, offices, and titles of all employees involved in the probes, which the FBI has agreed to provide after consulting legal counsel. The lawsuits do not identify the agents, who fear the list could be a precursor to mass firings and public retribution. Republican Senator Eric Schmidt of Missouri has said Trump is fulfilling a mandate from the American people to reform the FBI. Senate Republicans continue the confirmation process of President Trump's cabinet nominees despite Democratic opposition. Our Washington correspondent Luis Martinez has more on this story.
Vaccines play a critical role in healthcare. All of my kids are vaccinated. I've written many books on vaccines. My first book in 2014, the first line of it is, I am not anti-vaccine, and the last line is, I am not anti-vaccine.
That was Robert F. Kennedy Jr. during his confirmation hearing, dispelling one of the main claims against his nomination. The Senate's Finance Committee voted this Tuesday to advance the nomination of RFK Jr. to become the next Secretary of Health and Human Services.
Specifically, if it was his intent to let the scientists of the CDC, the NIH, BARDA, and other organizations to work independently. He said to me under oath that he would. If he fails to do that, that will be a concern for me and something I'll bring up in a future oversight hearing.
Tulsi Gabbard, President Trump's pick to be the next Director of National Intelligence, also received a favorable vote in the Senate's Intelligence Committee, with Republican Senator Susan Collins being the decisive vote.
I believe she's committed to strengthening our national security, and I questioned her extensively about her views on Edward Snowden, and I am now satisfied that she will not seek in any way to have him pardoned.
Trump's re-election is a clear mandate from the American people to break this cycle of failure, end the weaponization and politicization of the intelligence community, and begin to restore trust in those who've been charged with the critical task of securing our nation.
Next up for consideration on the Senate floor was Pam Bondi, President Trump's pick to be the next Attorney General of the United States after former Congressman Matt Gaetz stepped down from consideration.
If confirmed as the next Attorney General of the United States, my overriding objective will be to return the Department of Justice to its core mission of keeping Americans safe and vigorously prosecuting criminals.
On Tuesday, the Senate confirmed Doug Collins to be the next Secretary of Veterans Affairs. Reporting from Washington, D.C., Luis Eduardo Martinez, NTD News.
What does the future hold for America if Robert F. Kennedy Jr. takes the helm at HHS? NTD's Sam Wong was out on the National Mall in D.C. to hear from the people.
So what does the future hold for the country with RFK Jr. leading the HHS?
I think it's a great move. It will be a refresh, a start, getting away from WHO.
Well, I think it's definitely a major change kind of in policy. I mean, his background is certainly not traditional.
I'm a big fan of RFK. Personally, I like that he kind of stepped back to help Trump out a bit, because I personally believe we need big changes.
It's hard to know. I think it's some of his views are very troubling. particularly with regard to vaccines.
He is really concerned about America and America's health. So I think that overall he would do a good job, but I do think he's got a big learning curve to overcome.
And what are some of your concerns for RFK Jr. and what are your biggest hope?
Well, for RFK, I'd say the biggest thing is making sure our food supply is healthy. I'm a hardcore Democrat from Massachusetts, so certainly we were a little disappointed in the election from a political standpoint. But, you know, when the president takes office and he assembles his cabinet, we wish him well, and we want to make sure that the country is coming first.
I think he's certainly raised some interesting points with our food supply and processed foods and stuff. But I think certainly vaccines are probably one of the greatest medical advances we've had over the past 200 or 300 years.
So what are some of your biggest hope for him leading the HHS?
I just want him to take a look at vaccinations and everything in that regard. I feel like, you know, when we saw things kind of being pushed on us and kind of marketed to us and sold to us in a weird way, like, I didn't really appreciate that. So
I think the hope for him would be to be courageous and make sure that there's exposure and transparency to where we're going in the future.
My biggest hope for him is to make America healthy again. Most of our disease processes can be linked back to the additives and the chemicals that are found in our food. I think that he really cares about that and is very knowledgeable about that aspect of his job.
And I think we need to kind of tamper down on some of our food manufacturers here in the United States. And if those are the policies that Mr. Kennedy's going to put forth as the secretary, then I think that the nation should listen.
In an update on the Potomac tragedy, authorities have recovered the remains of all 67 victims of the mid-air collision. Officials confirmed that 66 of the victims have been positively identified. Now the focus is on helping the families of the victims recover, as well as salvaging and investigating the wreckage. Crews could be seen lifting large pieces of the American Airlines passenger plane from the river. So far, they have been able to pull one of the two jet engines from the river, along with one wing and large pieces of the plane's exterior. Crews will work to recover the Army helicopter later this week. The National Transportation Safety Board will be studying the wreckage and hopefully release a preliminary report within 30 days. Flights taking illegal immigrants to Guantanamo Bay in Cuba are starting today. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt made the announcement while on Fox News. Watch.
Today, the first flights from the United States to Guantanamo Bay with illegal migrants are underway. And so President Trump, Pete Hegseth, and Kristi Noem are already delivering on this promise to utilize that capacity at Gitmo for illegal criminals.
She added that the move is a key step in cracking down on illegal immigration and enhancing public safety. The goal is to send primarily immigrants who have committed crimes in addition to entering the U.S. illegally. The move comes after President Trump signed a memorandum last week. He directed Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth and Secretary of Homeland Security Kristi Noem to prepare Guantanamo Bay to house up to 30,000 illegal immigrants. Leavitt says the start of the flights marks a major step in implementing that directive. Permanently classifying fentanyl as a Schedule I drug was the main focus at a Senate hearing today. China's role in the trafficking process was also a hot topic. NTD correspondent Jason Blair reports.
The Senate Judiciary Committee met to discuss the latest in the U.S. fentanyl crisis. Committee Chairman Chuck Grassley says that the drug cartels must be stopped before they flood the U.S. with even deadlier versions of fentanyl.
In the last 4 years, for which we have data, that'd be 2 years ago, around 75,000 lives were lost to fentanyl alone, and that happens to work out to be about 200 people dying every day.
The committee's goal was to discuss the current fentanyl situation and the need to classify it permanently. Fentanyl has a temporary classification as a Schedule I drug, which is set to expire on March 31st.
That's why I hope that this committee supports the Halt Fentanyl Act, an act to permanently classify fentanyl-related substances as Schedule I under the Controlled Substances Act.
The way illegal fentanyl is coming into the U.S. is complex. However, the main process is most of it is made from precursor chemicals coming from China. Then cartels are smuggling the finished fentanyl in through the southern and northern borders.
China is the first domino that tips in contributing to the fentanyl crisis. They are the contributor of the vast majority of the precursor chemicals, and if we deal with that, that would be the first great first step in dealing with it.
When they say they're not, they're lying, right?
I would say they're not being truthful, yes.
The House Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party concluded that the Chinese regime is providing financial support to companies that make these precursor chemicals.
It wasn't until we did the investigation as a committee that we discovered they're actually subsidizing, they're giving tax rebates for the production of these fentanyl precursors, which are poisoning Americans.
President Trump has been actively negotiating with Canada, Mexico, and China to tackle the fentanyl crisis and other issues at the U.S. borders. Recently, Department of Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem rode with Border Patrol agents along the southern border. Her office says that since Trump has taken office, quote, daily encounters at our southern border have plunged 93%. Trump shut down the U.S.-Mexico border to asylum seekers with an executive order shortly after being sworn into office on January 20th. Reporting in Washington, D.C., Jason Blair, NTD News.
Thousands of federal workers have already accepted President Trump's buyout proposal since last week, and officials are expecting a lot more will join them. A Trump administration official told the Epoch Times that so far more than 20,000 federal workers have accepted the offer, and the official says the administration expects the largest spike is yet to come, namely 1 or 2 days before the Friday deadline. Trump's buyout offer protects federal workers against reductions in force processes that are expected to begin in the near future. It also allows them to receive full pay and benefits coverage for about 8 months. The offer is part of Trump's promised initiative to reduce the size and cost of the federal government. If 10% of the civilian workforce accepted the buyout offer, it would cut spending by more than $24 billion. Coming up, a gunman opens fire at an Israeli checkpoint in the West Bank, leaving several injured. Meanwhile, families of hostages rally in Washington, D.C., urging action from President Trump. Jason Perry reports when we come back. Welcome back. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Tensions escalate in the West Bank after a gunman opens fire on people at an Israeli checkpoint. Meanwhile, family members of hostages held by Hamas rally in D.C. as President Trump meets with Israel's prime minister. NTD's Jason Perry brings us the latest.
A gunman in the West Bank opened fire on Israeli soldiers who were manning a nearby checkpoint, injuring at least 6 people on Tuesday. Israeli soldiers returned fire and killed the gunman. A general in the Israel Defense Forces gave an update on the shooting, which took place in the West Bank, also known as Judea and Samaria.
This morning's engagement with a despicable terrorist who emerged from the northern Samaria region is a demonstration of the necessity of the counterterrorism operation in Judea and Samaria.
Israeli forces began their latest counterterrorism operations in the West Bank last month after the ceasefire began with Hamas in the Gaza Strip. Meanwhile, in the Gaza Strip, residents have been returning to their homes in Gaza City since Israeli forces opened up the crossings last week. Many of them stood in lines for hours to get a bag of bread.
There's nothing. No firewood, no gas, nothing at all. Everything is gone here in our area. We just came from the south recently. Back there, at least, there was a little bit of something.
However, some residents in the south did not appear to be in a much better situation as they were seen chasing trucks carrying humanitarian aid. More aid has been able to flow into the territory during the ceasefire, in which negotiators are now preparing for Phase 2, which will include a permanent end to the war and the release of all remaining hostages. Family members of hostages still held by Hamas rallied in D.C. on Tuesday, while President Trump met with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu.
If this deal falls apart, the hostage will die. It is not metaphor. It is true. You know it. I know it. And you are the only one who can stop it from happening. Please, President Trump, don't let them be forgotten. I have not come here as a politician or as an activist. I am an Israeli patriot, and I am simply here as a deeply concerned mother who wants to hold her son again.
People also rallied outside the U.S. Embassy in Tel Aviv on Tuesday, again calling on Trump to help release the 79 remaining hostages. Jason Perry, NTD News.
China is imposing retaliatory tariffs on the U.S. in response to President Trump's new 10% tariffs on all Chinese goods. This as Secretary of State Marco Rubio is working to counter Chinese influence in Central America. NTD's Washington correspondent Jack Bradley has more.
China has imposed retaliatory tariffs on the U.S. Now, this is after President Trump's new 10% tariffs on all Chinese goods that went into effect on Tuesday. China put 15% tariffs on liquefied natural gas and coal, and 10% on crude oil, farming equipment, cars from the U.S., and not that they get a ton of that anyway from the U.S., but right now China's economy is in a downward spiral. You can see that they didn't put import taxes on minerals needed for semiconductors. Now, Trump paused the 25% tariffs on Mexico and Canada for about a month as they promised to increase border security to stop the influx of fentanyl. According to the White House, Trump will speak with Chinese leader Xi Jinping in the next few days, so deal-making could be seen in the foreseeable future, but it would be hard to trust the Chinese regime with anything that they promise, seeing how they directly subsidize Chinese companies that manufacture and export fentanyl to the U.S. We know this from a congressional report back in April. Trump on Tuesday reassuring the American public.
Mr. President, what's your reaction to China's retaliatory tariffs?
It's fine. It's fine. We're going to do very well against China and against everybody else.
All of this comes as Secretary of State Marco Rubio is meeting with leaders in Central America and working to stem the Chinese Communist Party's infiltration, as well as stemming illegal immigration in the region. El Salvador's president has offered to imprison violent American criminals, whether they're U.S. citizens or not. Secretary Rubio said that this offer is generous, but there could be some legal issues here.
And that's an offer President Bukele made. Obviously, we'll have to study it on our end. There are obviously legalities involved. We have a constitution. We have all sorts of things. But it's a very generous offer. No one's ever made an offer like that. And to outsource at a fraction of the cost, at least some of the most dangerous and violent criminals that we have in the United States. But obviously, the administration will have to make a decision. I raised it yesterday because it's an incredible offer and an unprecedented one.
Now, this offer is unprecedented, but El Salvador's prisons have notoriously poor conditions. The State Department itself even describes them as harsh and dangerous. Meanwhile, Rubio was in Costa Rica on Tuesday meeting with their president, and he promised more U.S. support to Costa Rica to counter drug cartels, which Trump named as foreign terrorist organizations.
But when you confront these groups, they become violent, and they become vicious. And so we want to see how we can work, perhaps by allowing more DEA and FBI resources to conduct investigations together with your police and your law enforcement to identify and help you capture and arrest them and bring them to justice.
Rubio's heading to Guatemala and the Dominican Republic to finish up his first trip abroad as top diplomat. He already visited Panama, which is working to rid itself of Chinese Communist Party infiltration from its ports on both ends of the Panama Canal. Jack Bradley, NTD News.
In exchange for the one-month pause on President Donald Trump's 25% tariffs, Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum starts deploying National Guard troops to the U.S. border.
We've already started moving the troops. The plan was developed by the Secretary of Defense and his team. In some areas where National Guard personnel are stationed, but security issues are less severe, they are being reassigned to the northern border. Others, who were previously stationed in the southern region, will now be moved to the northern border. This deployment does not leave the rest of the country without security, as there are a total of 120,000 National Guard members. People should know that we are not leaving any states unprotected. Rather, it is a reorientation of forces.
The Air Forces of the Philippines and the United States held joint patrols over the South China Sea earlier today. China, angered by the move. China's military today lashed out at the Philippines over the joint patrol and threatened to use military force to rule the region. The Philippines is one of the oldest U.S. treaty allies in the Indo-Pacific. The joint patrol comes as the two countries ramp up security cooperation to counter threats posed by China in the South China Sea. Over the past few years, the tensions between China and the Philippines have escalated. China claims almost the entire South China Sea as its own. A 2016 international arbitration ruled that invalid. Vessels owned by the Philippines and neighboring countries face frequent harassment from Chinese Coast Guard ships there. Swedish police said at least 10 people were killed today after a gunman opened fire at an adult education center. The shooter is believed to be among those killed. NTD's Andrew Thomas has more on the dreadful tragedy.
About 125 miles west of Stockholm, Swedish police in Örebro encountered a bloody scene at this adult education center. Authorities said a final death toll and number of wounded couldn't be determined yet.
What we are doing right now involves several parts. Part of this involves identifying the deceased, as well as following up on the condition of the injured. Additionally, there is an extensive investigative effort underway. We still believe that we have the primary perpetrator, although we are not ruling out connections to others.
Officials said the perpetrator wasn't previously known to police.
Right now, we feel more confident that no further attacks will take place, and the schools that were affected have been evacuated. As I see it, there is no ongoing danger, even though both we and the municipality, of course, have a significant amount of work ahead to discuss what has happened and how to ensure safety.
Police raided the suspect's home after the shooting, but it wasn't immediately clear what they found. Andrew Thomas, NTD News.
Coming up, another round of tit-for-tat tariffs between the U.S. and China. An economist joins us to look into potential impacts on the global economy. That and more after the break. Welcome back. If you're just joining us now, here are some of today's top headlines. President Trump signed a memorandum ratcheting up sanctions on Iran with the aim of preventing the regime from having a nuclear weapon. He also pulled the U.S. out of the UN Human Rights Council, saying it shields human rights violators. Two separate Senate committees voted to advance the nominations of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and Tulsi Gabbard, and the full Senate confirmed Doug Collins as Secretary of Veterans Affairs. President Trump is meeting with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu at the White House, the first visit of a foreign leader in Trump's second term. The president suggested that Palestinians from Gaza should permanently resettle elsewhere and asked Arab nations to take them in temporarily. Trump's 10% tariff on all Chinese imports is now in effect. In response, the Chinese regime said it would implement a 15% tariff on U.S. coal and liquefied natural gas products, as well as a 10% tariff on American crude oil, agricultural machinery, and large engine cars starting next Monday. And joining us now to discuss the latest on Trump's tariffs is Christian Briggs, economist and CEO of Hard Asset Management. Christian, thank you so much for joining us. Good to have you here. Now, the tariffs on China kicked in today with China vowing retaliatory tariffs. Chinese regime leader Xi Jinping put tariffs on only $14 billion worth of American imports. That's a fraction of what Trump targeted, $525 billion. What do you think this tells us? Is this a strategic move by China?
Well, yeah, it's very strategic. What Xi Jinping is trying to do is he had to come up with something to be able to answer Trump's first round of tariffs. So he did a very smart thing. I will give him credit. He very clearly made just a small amount of gesture tariffs. You almost want to kind of say he kind of took the ball in this court and said, I'm not really going to throw it back at you like dodgeball and try to smack you too hard, but I am going to have to do something in order to keep myself from losing face. China does not want a trade war. We are the largest production buyer of everything that they make. So when we're the consumption of the end of their manufacturing, he cannot afford to have $1 trillion in trade deficit go away so quickly. So he had to make some kind of a gesture in order for his own people to respect him. But what he did do was some things. Now, we're going to have to see what Trump does, or Xi Jinping may actually increase that, but I don't think so. I think Trump's kind of got him in the corner right now. He doesn't want to do any more retaliation tariffs.
Now, Bloomberg is noting China's success at diversifying imports away from the U.S., but also China's own precarious economic situation that China has more to lose. In your view, why would China impose its own tariffs first and not come to the negotiating table as we saw Mexico and Canada do?
Well, I think that China has always looked at themselves as a country that is ultimately going to try to take on the United States from a financial supremacy model.
Now, given the U.S. and China are the world's two biggest economies, what's the likely trickle-down impact on global trade if tariffs continue to escalate?
Well, the trickle-down effect is going to be inflation. There's no way around it. Now, that inflation can be mitigated in such a way that it has a nominal effect on the economy. And a lot of the markets have already priced in some kind of inflationary reaction on the tariffs. So when you're looking at the equity markets and even the interest rates on treasuries, they've got some of this pricing already done inside their values. But let's take it for a little bit here further down the road. If this thing becomes a tit for tat type of retaliatory or even an escalation in a full-blown trade wars, which I don't think it's going to quite get that high, but if it does, then inflation is going to pick up dramatically. See, think about this for a second. We consume about 70% of all the manufactured goods that come into America are made by foreign markets. So China obviously is the largest provider of that manufacturing. India and Mexico obviously being a second and third. So if they do continue to raise tariffs out of China, that will have a profound effect on pricing. Pricing is obviously inflationary as it moves up. So the Fed, in its own approach to either cutting rates or holding steady, may have to hold rates where they are, keeping rates elevated for some time to come, if in fact this thing continues to grow. And I do expect some kind of an escalation in tariffs. It may not be at the hyperinflation or the 100%, but I don't think China's going to back down. I think that President Xi Jinping has too much to lose within his own party to be able to sit there and take it. So he's going to have to come up with some ideas on how to counterbalance it. And you make a good point earlier. They are diversifying away from the U.S., not as dependent upon both the dollar as well as manufacturing orders that come from the U.S. They're now a global presence with the second largest economy in the world. So just remember, when you're looking at this, China is a lot bigger of a country and an economy than it was in President Trump's first term back in 16, 17. They've come a long way, especially with BRICS. But I do believe Trump has a plan. I believe he understands surgically and very tactfully applying tariffs 5, 10, 15%. His new Secretary of the Treasury is a rock star, very smart man, very gifted in the sense of understanding economics. So I would say this, let's give the president some time to work through these things. Let's all look at it from the standpoint of about a 3 to maybe 4 month time period. But I do believe that Trump will be victory on this one across the board, just like he was with Canada and Mexico.
Expanding on that, what's the likely impact for Americans? How will a trade war with no substantive deal impact them?
Well, okay, let's talk about the worst case. Trade wars, it's kind of like tic-tac-toe. Sometimes there are no winners. It's kind of a void. But in this case, I think China will lose the trade war. Now, the U.S. consumer is going to have to pay a pretty penny for this because, yes, you will then have escalating interest rates. In fact, don't be surprised if we do get in a full-blown trade war, which is, it's possible. I'm not going to say it's not likely. It could definitely get to that point. And so you make a good point by asking the question. The ramifications on a U.S. consumer, and just anybody for that matter, it's going to be $4,000, $5,000, maybe $6,000 a year in additional costs if it's a full-blown trade war. Remember back in the first term, the average family paid over $1,200 back then, and that was back in 17, 18. Now we've had inflation almost double pretty much everything across the board, especially in food, housing, energy prices are obviously double. So if we're going to see an escalation in the trade wars on the tariffs, this could actually push inflation into the low double digits. I mean, we could see 8, 9%, and that would be horrific for the economy. Nobody's going to be able to win. China will lose and we'll lose. We may win in the long run, but at least in the near term, this could be devastating for the economy.
On that note, where do you see U.S.-China trade relations going forward? Do you see the U.S. under Trump significantly decoupling from China over the next 4 years?
I do. I don't think we're going to be decoupling completely, but I think we're going to start to see some measure of diversification away from China manufacturing as exclusive provider. Take Apple, for example. When they were working with Foxconn in China, when they had the trade wars, that China kind of recognized that at that point, and still to this day, that America is the greatest economy in the world. Apple had to recognize that if the trade wars were to escalate back then, they weren't ready to start having a major disruption within their company for iPhone manufacturing and iPads and other ancillary products. So they moved it to India. which obviously is a little bit less hostile in the way in which they kind of go back and forth on good trade agreements. China, however, has a goal. The BRICS have a goal. The BRICS undermining the dollar usage around the world and bringing a longer play strategy to make China financially stronger than the U.S. And make no mistake about it, President Xi Jinping ran on the idea that China will ultimately win the financial and even the military supremacy race. Now, it's a hard thing to understand that they could do that, but look at where they've come in 10 years. So we have to be mindful that China's goal is to bring awareness to their country as the largest economy soon to be if they continue at this rate. And if we don't get our house in order on our debt and deficit spending, China definitely is going to be a competition.
A lot at stake here. Christian Briggs, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Coming up in the NBA, Luka Doncic finally shares his thoughts on the blockbuster trade that sent him to LA. Dave Martin joins us to discuss when we return. Welcome back. I'm Tiffany Meyer now for your sports news. We're joined by NTD's Dave Martin. Dave, a lot going on today, but let's start in the NFL as Commissioner Roger Goodell actually addressed the speculation that the Kansas City Chiefs have received preferential treatment from the referees, calling it a ridiculous theory. What was he referring to here?
He didn't specify, which plays exactly, but certainly on social media, there were a couple of plays highlighted, especially in the Bills game during these playoffs that could have gone the other way, I'll say that. I mean, the spotting on the ball in that 4th and short against Buffalo looked generous for the Chiefs. That was a play where Josh Allen did a quarterback sneak and he just kind of got lost in the scrum of players. So it was admittedly difficult to see exactly where the ball should be, but on his initial burst, it did look like he got the first down. The spot the refs gave him, though, was short of the first down marker, ended up being a critical turnover on downs. And that was in the 4th quarter. The Chiefs took over then right there, scored 5 players there to take the lead, and they would not relinquish it. There was also that near interception against the Bills, which was ruled a catch actually by the Chiefs somehow. Now, there was already a penalty on Buffalo on the play, but the yards gained by the catch was much more than the penalty would have been. And even in the previous game against Houston, there were a couple of roughing the passer penalties that maybe couldn't have been called. I mean, now for the fans of the Chiefs like myself, we certainly weren't complaining, but there were some questionable calls, I'll say that.
Well, elsewhere in the league, Rams All-Pro receiver Kupp says he was informed that the team will be trading him. How does his trade value compare to Cleveland's Myles Garrett, who we discussed yesterday?
Garrett probably has more value. I mean, for one thing, he's younger. He's 29. Kupp is 31. Kupp was the NFL's Offensive Player of the Year in 2021. He has not been to a Pro Bowl since, though. He's missed 18 games over the past 3 years due to injuries. Garrett, meanwhile, he's been a first-team All-Pro for the last 5 years. He's still the reigning Defensive Player of the Year. He's showed no signs of slowing down. I mean, he gets after the quarterback. He is the best in the league in that. Now, their contracts are relevant, too. I mean, Garrett is owed relatively low salaries over the next 2 years, $20 million apiece. Kupp is owed $20 million next year as well, too. But trades are much different in the NFL. Instead of a player for trade, it's only player for draft picks trades. I would say someone of Garrett's nature, they probably could get 2 first-round picks, which is a lot. Kupp probably would be more of a mid-round pick, but we won't actually find out until the offseason starts, which will be after the Super Bowl, which is coming up Sunday.
Shifting gears to NBA news, the Lakers formally introduced their newest superstar, Luka Doncic, today. What was his reaction to being there?
He was shocked. I mean, like the rest of us, it's pretty incredible how secret these trade talks between the Lakers and Mavericks were. I mean, there's so many times where somehow trade talks are leaked to the media, and the bigger the trade, typically, the bigger the chance that it'll be leaked. This is one of the biggest trades in the history of the league, and no one knew about it until it was announced. In any case, Doncic said he's excited to be a Laker. They are the premier franchise in the NBA, and he gets to play with LeBron James, whom he called his idol. Now, one of his teammates, Markieff Morris, who was traded with him to LA, commented on his perception of why Doncic was traded when he said, quote, "I hear the stuff about him not being in shape, but if you can go in an NBA game and get 30 and 15 and 10 like it's nothing, then I don't really know what shape is." Now, the Mavericks didn't say they traded him because he was out of shape. I mean, they talked about him about culture and how they wanted defense. Nothing about his conditioning. Anyway, Doncic, though, has not played since Christmas because of a calf strain. Apparently, though, he's very close to a return.
Well, now that the Lakers have Doncic, are there more trades in the works to replace Anthony Davis at center?
Yeah, Lakers general manager Rob Pelinka kind of said the obvious when he was asked about it. He said, we know we have a need for a big. Now, they've got Jackson Hayes starting at center the last couple of games because Anthony Davis has actually been out. But they'll probably need a lot more depth there. But they've got a couple of problems, and the trade deadline is just 2 days away. That's on Thursday. And they don't really have too many tradable assets. I mean, they're not trading LeBron James. Obviously, they aren't trading Doncic. The only future first-round pick they have to dangle is the one from 2031. That's because the NBA rules prohibit teams from leaving themselves without future first-round picks in consecutive years. So this will be very interesting to see what they come up with on very short notice here and without much to trade.
Davis, always, thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you, Tiff.